Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DocTalk. How are you doing today, Dr. Hannan?
I'm well. How are you, Dr. Knopf?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm excited for our conversation today. It's so important and covers so much groundwork. We will be dividing up our content, right, into two different talks, correct?
Correct. This is part one today of Health at Every Size, something you and I are both very passionate about and really excited to dig into.
Absolutely. And again, I'm Dr. Erin Knopf.
I'm Dr. Corinne Hannan. Welcome.
Welcome. Let's do our DocTalk.
All right, let's start talking about health at every size. This is usually a brand new piece of information for people. This is a new topic, new category. And just to kick it off, Dr. Knopf, I'm just curious what you were taught, for example, in medical school as the definition of health.
What's really interesting is I actually can't remember like a formal definition given to us as med students. I think ultimately health was framed as the absence of pathology, the absence of illness. And unfortunately, a lot of that was only looked through from the perspective of how weight affects health, not all of the other myriad of influences. So it was certainly a little, I can't even say a little with a straight face. It was completely myopic and completely discriminatory from the beginning.
Yeah, so pretty disease-based, pretty like
Mm-hmm.
individual responsibility-based. That's how it was for me, both growing up as well as in my advanced education. Health was really discussed in some really simplistic, overly simplistic categories. So just from the perspective of weight and from the perspective of like diet and exercise. So as I've grown older and hopefully wiser and become more of an expert in terms of what health means for individual people, I think health at every size is a beautiful way to expand our definition of health to be more inclusive, more holistic, and more helpful. So
Awesome.
health, if you'll advance to the next slide, the
Yeah.
next, yeah, health at every size has 5 principles. Um, sorry, I can't see the next slide.
There you go.
There we
Sorry
go.
about that.
And like you said, Dr. Knopf, it's different than I think how you explained medical school, where it's about the absence or removing physical or mental illness or limitation or disease. It's a lot more holistic.
Mm-hmm.
So that health can't be characterized by something that's simplistic, and it exists on a continuum, and it varies with a lot of variables, context, time, and circumstances that are available to each individual. It's also it teaches that health should be conceived as a resource or capacity available to all, regardless of their health condition or ability level, and not as an outcome or objective of living.
I
Now,
love how you expanded upon that definition because I think it's so important for people to realize the context matters, where someone is in their life, what resources are available, what influences have affected their engagement in their human existence. All of these parts are dynamic and interplay together.
yeah, they've been shown. We'll talk about social determinants of health later on in one of these webinars, but it's been shown that there are so many complicated variables as to why people do or do not achieve or become closer to health. The most important part of health at every size to me that was new learning to me was this idea that pursuing health is neither a moral imperative nor an individual obligation. When I grew up, it was just
Mm,
kind of considered like everyone would want to be healthy. And while I think there's some merit to talking about, of course, I think the vast majority of people want to pursue health, but it's not an imperative or an obligation. And so we should not use the pursuit of health, which is laden with all sorts of contextual and accessibility variables. We should not use that as a status to judge, oppress, or determine the value of an individual. It's really about social justice and accessibility. So I love the idea of health at every size being accessible, but not an imperative, and it should never be used to discriminate.
absolutely.
Is
Well,
that is
let's
that something that you got teachings about in medical school?
Of course not. Absolutely not. If anything, I think more about my education focused on prevalence and incidence of different disease pathologies, especially in psychiatry, as it related to socioeconomic status and race, ethnicity, whether you were an immigrant. It was more focused on, oh, yes, this happens more in this population, but never the deeper exploration of why or what other factors could have influenced this. So it wasn't a natural outcome just because they are who they are. It really had to do with a lot of other factors and influences.
Yes, in addition to the social determinants of health, another factor that we'll discuss at a later webinar are ACEs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really powerful research to advance understanding of the complexities of health outcomes and of risk factors in developing various diseases that previously were really explained in overly simplistic and misunderstanding the importance of like stress, abuse, trauma, neglect, all sorts of factors in your environment that also contribute. So health at
Totally.
every size, I feel like, is so much more of an umbrella of what it means to have accessibility to health options and to treat people with true dignity and respect, regardless of their proximity to health.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but for those of you who don't know what ACEs are, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So we will, as Dr. Hannan said, talk about those in a later webinar. But just a review from our last webinar, the 5 principles of HAES include weight inclusivity, health enhancement, eating for well-being, respectful care, and life-enhancing movement. For this webinar today, part 1, we will focus first and foremost on 1 and 2, and we will explore 3, 4, and 5 at our next webinar.
Okay, let's kick it off with principle 1, weight inclusivity. I'm going to go ahead and read what this principle embodies because I think it's just really beautiful language to kick off understanding principle 1, which is accepting and respecting the inherent diversity of body shapes and sizes, and reject the idealizing or pathologizing of specific weights. So, what does inherent diversity mean? I think we can harken back to our discussion about the BMI, where the BMI was taking into account like what an average white male in Europe at the time of this data collection, which happened to be from the military, that was what an average white male European looked like. That did not take into account at least women at all. It didn't take into account racial or ethnic diverse bodies. So weight inclusivity includes that bodies are inherently wildly diverse and not average.
Well,
So
if
it
anything, too, just to, for a reminder, the average in this case is not necessarily the mean, like we think in math, where it's the true average, where you sum up everything together and divide it by the total number of variables that were looked at, but it's simply the middle. What was the middle measurement? And so that means that there are bodies that are perfectly healthy in their form across the spectrum. There are smaller bodies, there are larger bodies, and all are worthy of appropriate health assessment and health direction.
Absolutely. This is what's so beautiful about weight inclusivity. So I really like this this image that body size, body weight is and even body composition is just not accurate. We talked about last time that the BMI like quote unquote correctly categorizes people maybe like half of the time and miscategorizes just as much. So you may as well flip a coin. It's just not useful. It's not effective. It's not correct. It's not it's not inclusive and it's not respectful.
Well, and if anything, too, what I love about HAES is not only the presentation of different definitions for how do we want to define health and strive to promote health in some way. Again, it's optional for all people, but, try to have some shared language. But it also really emphasizes that we need to unlearn things that we previously were taught. So I'm curious, if you want to share a little bit more as related to principle 1, what we can unlearn.
Yeah, so I think part of what understanding HAES involves is just as much as learning is actively unlearning, as you said. So I was taught growing up in the United States of America that weight is a very important determinant of understanding your health, like your waist circumference, your waist or your weight and that in relationship to your height. So it's really about unlearning that that's simply not true. There's mountains of evidence that this is absolutely not true. And so that smaller is also not necessarily better. I think body sizes, body types occur on a bell curve, which means lots of variability, with the average being like the most bodies kind of circle around the average, but there's bodies of all shapes and sizes. I'm a really, really tall woman, for example. I'm taller than most men and women. And so I would be different in a different space on that distribution just based on my height alone, but that doesn't say anything about my health. It's just how my body, it's just what I got DNA wise.
Yeah, and on the flip side, I am on the shorter side of life, but was an athlete and had a lot of musculature. And yes, absolutely heard in my own doctor's appointments that I am obese at different times in my life, because at the end of the day, with that BMI equation, which we know is so silly, it puts height in the denominator. So when you're really short, guess what? Automatically calculates differently.
Wow. It's just silly is the nicest way to put it. It's silly at best,
Yeah,
harmful, and completely useless at worst. So
totally.
we also have to unlearn that having a smaller body is having a better body. Another thing we're going to be talking about in these webinars are some of the origins of kind of the ideas around like weight and small bodies being superior. And there's also like a lot of racist origins with that, like eugenic origins, if you get into kind of medical history and the history of the world. Another unlearn is that weight is a matter of individual responsibility. Why do you think we
Mm.
have to unlearn that, Dr. Knopf?
Because for so long, I think this is what feeds into weight stigma that we also will continue to explore through this platform. But it really created this sense of you're doing something wrong if you are in a bigger body, versus the fact that you might just genetically be predispositioned to have the body you have, and you didn't do anything wrong or right to get there. And so, how do we actually reduce this overall psychological burden of wrongness? It really is important to know that this isn't your responsibility to manage. This wasn't a failure of your parents or a failure of your physicians. If you're in a larger body, that entire narrative has actually caused more harm than it has saved lives. We've actually seen lots of studies to prove this. The whole quote unquote war on obesity has actually not affected how people feel about themselves or how successful they are in living their bodies when they are only striving for weight management approaches.
Exactly. I mean, like you said, there are a mountain of studies, but I'm going to mention two that are really hallmarks to me. So, if weight really is a matter of individual responsibility, one thing you would expect to see is that children in families where they've been adopted would have body sizes and shapes similar to their adoptive parents, because they're going to be exposed to food and movement behaviors based on their adoptive family. But the research shows the opposite, which is that adopted children have BMIs, which we don't like BMI, but this is the data that they're using, have BMIs very similar to their biological parents. So
Ding,
that,
ding,
yeah,
ding.
exactly. So that in and of itself, it's like the individual responsibility narrative is being debunked. Another one is that, we've talked about this already, how diets are misrepresentations, and although they may deliver weight loss on a short-term basis, on the long term, they backfire, meaning that people tend to gain more weight and then have
Yep.
their metabolisms drop. The Biggest Loser is a really good example of this, like that horrific show where people were abused openly, publicly, verbally, and otherwise, to lose a dramatic amount of weight. And long-term follow-ups of The Biggest Loser, one contestant has been able to kind of manage successfully keeping off their weight. And I have suspicions about what that involves, and which, yeah.
Yep.
So the reality is that when you shock your body with dramatic weight loss, and weight loss that isn't in line with your body's biological set point range where it feels safe and at ease biologically, you affect mechanisms in your body, including your metabolism. So that people that do like gastric bypass surgery or do like The Biggest Loser, for example, It affects these physiological mechanisms that manage kind of your weight status. And so people tend to gain weight when eating very, very low calorie diets.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just another example of how weight really isn't as simplistic as what you're eating and how you're moving. There are so many complex variables, genetic and environmental, that affect your body size. And it's just harmful to perpetuate myths and stereotypes to the opposite.
Right. And to again put that ownership on the individual when really they could be focused more on perhaps education, occupation, family, friendships, activities. There's so many other things in their lives that they could be connecting with, but
Yeah,
instead they are constantly reminded just focus on your weight, and all
yeah.
things beautiful will come
Yeah,
to you.
travel, making money,
Yeah.
whatever you want to do. One more study that I'll re-mention is that 2,000 sets of identical twins in Finland were studied, and one was put on a diet and the other one wasn't. And the dieting twin gained weight in a dose dependent manner, consistent with how many diets they went on. So, again, complex genetic and environmental variables determine how your body responds to what it sees as like starvation and or where your body feels at ease. So
And I
weight is
think
an individual responsibility. Go ahead.
totally. Well, I think, this feeds into, they all go together as far as what are other things, principles we need to unlearn as individuals in today's day and age. It's that, again, all bodies are not the same size, but also what's right for one is not right for all. There might be a reason that someone does go on a specialized diet. But just because you know they're on a diet doesn't mean you know that it was for the right reason or it's appropriately monitored and supervised by health providers. So there's so much more nuance there. Diets should not be the run of the mill activity that everyone is engaged in because it isn't right for everyone. So
Exactly.
it's really important to unlearn that concept. It might be necessary for some, weight loss might be necessary for certain medical conditions, but definitely not the entire gauntlet of, health and wellness that we have been previously taught.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we need individuality, uniqueness, and compassion. And so it's
Absolutely.
really unlearning that it's about personal responsibility and that weight is the be all end all.
Correct. All right. Principle
All right.
2, tell us more about health enhancement. We've already kind of, brushed up on some of them, but I am very excited for you to expand upon it here.
Yeah, so I love this graphic because I think it begins to tap into the multifaceted, holistic complexity of what health actually might mean. And it's not just about weight, it's not just about what you eat or don't eat, and it's not just about how you move, but how are you socially well? How are you occupationally well and fulfilled? Are you emotionally well and fulfilled and connected? Are you financially at ease and have a plan
Mm,
and feel like you can access what you need to feel fulfilled and safe and at ease and also pursue fun if possible? What's your environment? Do you have green space? Do you have clean air? Do you have green water? Are you safe from gun violence? Are you safe from violence in all capacities?
yeah,
What is your intellectual health? What kind of learning and access do you have available to you? And then what's your spiritual health? Do you have practices that enhance you feeling kind of connected to a bigger purpose or the universe or other individuals or nature or animals, other beings? So I just think that health enhancement as a principle is a really about expanding our definition of
mm,
health, like really infinitely expanding it, and also about supporting policy that improves and equalizes access to information, access to services, access to opportunity, and then also personal practices that improve well-being. So it's social
absolutely.
and it's personal. And that includes attention to individual, physical, economic, spiritual, emotional, and ongoing other needs, even like recreational needs or all sorts of needs that just really are not defined or addressed in a very simplistic definition of health as your weight and or your exercise habits.
If anything, I was thinking about it here, as far as where does a physician come into this? It really is just in that physical sphere, which is only one of many here, as far as, health as defined by vitals, labs, um, anthropometric measurements, all of those things really only fall into physical. And I think it is so important for physicians, family members, everyone, let's be honest, everyone, teachers, PE teachers and coaches and principals to know that this is actually what most impacts a human being in their lifespan. And it's not just the one sphere that we tend to put the most emphasis on.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for saying that. I think I am so grateful for Western medicine. And I think something that, as we talk about the ACEs, for example, that you mentioned, the adverse childhood experiences research that will bring up, it's starting to show that we can't separate this stuff out. Like, it's not going to be useful to just focus on the physical, for example. So the ACEs research is about really putting together medical and behavioral health because they impact each other. Shockingly, our brains and our bodies are not separate.
Weird.
Yeah, we're all a holistic being operating in these systems and have very multifaceted needs and ways that that affects our life and our health and our wellness. So I think that moving forward, one thing that Health at Every Size is really providing is a better framework to incorporate all this multifaceted health information that helps people not just treat illness, but prevent illness and problems and stress.
Hopefully, should our
Hopefully.
research actually be fruitful enough. So obviously there's so many spheres that influence each other. If anything, right now this diagram shows them influencing their neighbor, but really they all overlap together in the middle as well, but it'd be hard to read. That means that there's a multitude of things to continue to unlearn. And so we're just going to highlight a few here today, as we are all committed to this journey of really improving holistic health.
Yeah, so here are 4 principles that we can consider that we might need to unlearn that we've been taught throughout our lives when in regards to health enhancement. So we've already kind of covered this, that health is not determined by diet and exercise only. It's so much more multifaceted than that. And the research is only really, in the Western research specifically, is only really beginning to unveil that in big and dramatic ways. And that's the direction we need to go. So yeah, there's some of the things that I talk about with clients all the time are sleep and social nourishment.
Mm.
I say movement. That's one of the principles we're going to talk about later, life enhancing movement. But for me specifically, getting some sunshine, if possible. And then getting, it's not just diet, but it's about getting enough food and getting a variety of foods, which we'll continue to talk about, and eating consistently. And all that stuff is also dependent on privilege and access, as well as your mental health.
Totally. I think it's so important. And again, remember everyone watching this, this is the page of what not to believe anymore, what to unlearn. So
Yeah.
these statements are not what we want you to ingrain in your head. We want you to do the opposite. But especially the physical appearance component, I find so interesting. And Dr. Hannan, I'm curious your thoughts too. How many people assume because someone presents in a certain body type that they are healthy when there could be a myriad of other issues going on for them that are actually in that physical health sphere. But certainly, as we know, in the emotional health sphere, it can be a lot harder to define just from a superficial glance. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things that we need to unlearn, that we're
Mm-hmm.
taught that like a specific idealized physical appearance means someone's healthy. And I will just say in my work as an eating disorder therapist, some of the people that I've worked with to a non-trained outside observer, they would be probably categorized as like ideal, attractive, healthy, and they're some of the sickest people I've ever worked with or
Yeah.
met in my life. So you really can't use your eyes to determine health. You can't use just a scale either. So like a lot of people like are in social media circles and they're
Mm.
promoting like diets and exercise and being influencers, and they get a lot of followers and they get a lot of social capital based on their appearance. And that's just not a good practice. It's not true. It's not helpful. So health cannot be determined by someone's physical appearance. In fact, that tells me very little about someone's relationship with food. It tells me very little about someone's relationship with stress. Oftentimes, it tells me that they might have genetics that look a certain way and or access to lots. There's actually some really great Hollywood influencers that are really open about, like, I have a personal trainer. I have access to a chef. I have all these things going for me that help me kind of keep my body looking a specific way for certain roles. This has everything to do with privilege. It has nothing to do with me being healthy or credentialed or whatever. So I think it's
Yeah.
very problematic to think that physical appearance is somehow healthy.
I think it's problematic too. When I think back to medical training, it was and is part of the training of what can you pick up on when you walk into a room before you meet the patient, before you've even asked a question or they've introduced themselves, what can you pick up on? So there's a lot of emphasis on that as well. And there is some good value to doing that, being aware of one's surroundings, and all of your senses being ready to take in data is an important part, I think, of being a present clinician. But ultimately, when I've heard other providers say, I know everything I need to know about the patient just from looking at them through the door, I mean, you could pick my jaw off the ground. It's just
Yeah.
so inconceivable that someone could feel emboldened and confident just from that alone, that they know someone's health status.
Yeah, that's I think bias and prejudice right there, which
Oh, for
we want
sure.
to undo and not promote.
Unlearn,
Yeah, unlearn.
unlearn.
So the last two that we'll mention is that weight loss efforts are definitely not always health promoting. Oftentimes it's quite the opposite. Oftentimes weight loss efforts and solely weight loss efforts tend to worsen people's relationship with food, increase preoccupation with food, cause disordered eating at best, and can lead to an eating disorder at worst. And we'll continue to talk about weight loss efforts and the problems just in focusing on weight loss alone. It also has physiological and metabolic effects that tend to be the opposite of what people are seeking. And that the last is that health is universally defined. It One of the big tenets of health at every size is that health is unique, individual, multifaceted, and holistic. And again, available to all, but not a moral obligation for all. So we have to unlearn the idea that this is a universal definition of what health might mean. Anything you might add to that, Dr. Knopf?
No, if anything, I was like, for the people in the back, health is not universally defined. If anything, I love this conversation. I love the opportunity to really help bring more information to people so that they can actually access their own individual right to choice and to define what they want for their body and their lives, by having complete information rather than just getting a single angle that previously has existed. So we will have 3 more principles to talk about at our next webinar. So please join us then. Again, this is DocTalk with me, Dr. Erin Knopf.
And me, Dr. Corinne Hannan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye.